All right. So, according to Jonathan Culler, who is also our historian of literary criticism, we turn to with structuralism. According to Jonathan Culler, there are several tropes or tendencies in deconstructive criticism that aim to disclose the non-origin or the non-meaning or the resistance to single meaning at the heart of a literary work. So this handout, which I will also, like I said, I think in a last video, be posting on Sakai, each of the quotes from Culler correspond to a different tendency or a different. I don't know if I should call it a technique. I'm not really sure what to call it, so I'm just going to call it a tendency in what is usually considered deconstructive literary criticism. Okay, and so these quotes are a bit difficult. So what I'm going to do is read them, but then try to elucidate them a little bit. Okay. The deconstructively oriented critic, this is the second quote, will be on the lookout for different sorts of conflict. The first is the asymmetrical opposition or value-laden hierarchy, in which one term is promoted at the expense of the other. The question for the critic is whether the second term, treated as a negative, marginal, or supplementary version of the first, does not prove to be the condition of possibility of the first. In other words, the first tendency is the isolation by the critic of certain binary oppositions, a tendency in structuralism as well, which the critic then shows to be a value-laden binary, meaning that there is a hierarchy between the two terms that are usually considered, or often considered, to be somewhat in a valueless or neutral relationship. For Derrida, there is no neutral binary opposition. So what does this have to do with deconstruction? Well, Derrida likes to deconstruct these binaries, and to show that a text's reliance on value-laden binaries often undoes itself, sometimes showing that the valued term is often subordinate to the undervalued or underprivileged term, that our hierarchies, our dearest hierarchies, break themselves down, especially when we're not even paying attention. So how does this translate into criticism, right? Does Miller do this? Of course he does. Right? I just went over in the first or the second video of this series how he does it with the binary of ascension and falling, or rising and falling, or life and death, as it were. The Woolf's novel does, at times, value the positive side of these binaries, rising, ascension, composition, arrangement, life, setting them firmly within an opposition. It is clear, at least for Miller, and those sympathetic to his readings, that Woolf's novel often values the former through the latter. Okay, so let's turn to page 199. 199 in Miller's book. Okay. 199. In the life of the characters, this moment of completion passes. The party ends. Sally, Peter, Clarissa, and the rest move on towards death. Victory of the narrator is to rescue from death this moment and all the other moments of the novel in that All Souls Day at a second power, which is literature. Literature for Woolf is repetition as preservation, but preservation of things and persons in their antithetical poise. Time is rescued by this repetition. It is rescued in its perpetual reversing divisions. It is lifted into the region of death with which the mind of the narrator has from the first page been identified. This is the place of absence, where nothing exists but words. These words generate their own reality. Clarissa, Peter, and the rest can be encountered only in the pages of the novel. The reader enters this realm of language when he leaves his own solid world and begins to read Mrs. Dalloway. The novel is a double resurrection. The characters exist for themselves as alive in a present which is a resuscitation of their dead pasts. In the all-embracing mind of the narrator, the characters exist as dead men and women, whose continued existence depends on her words. when the circle of the narration is complete, past joining present, the apparently living characters reveal themselves to be already dwellers among the dead. Okay. So in that sense, any notion of resurrection or of life, right, or of a fruitful or productive repetition requires the condition of death, right? And so that's one example of the way in which Miller might, using the kind of clumsy lingo that Parker cites in his chapter, breaking down or deconstructing or exploding the binary of life and death. Excuse me. Another feature of deconstructive literary criticism is to isolate in a single figure or image the deconstructive operation that undoes and repeats the binary opposition that the literary critic is studying. I'm not going to read it, but that's what's going on in the third quote on your handout. That's what Culler calls in that quote a point of condensation, right? One term that kind of captures in its ambiguity the entirety of the deconstructive project that is under analysis. Though the figure that the critic uses is usually found in the literary text, Miller adopts a commonplace figure to capture the opposition of life and death, rising and falling, the present and the past, etc. in Mrs. Dalloway, namely that of a glass or a mirror. Right. So I'm not going to read the passages in which he does this, but I will point the pages out to you. Page 181, 185, 192, and 195. If you go back there, try to find the moment where he uses the image of glass or a mirror and how that figure actually works for Miller in a variety of ways, right? And actually captures all the kind of dynamic movements, all the resistances that in Mrs. Dalloway to any coherent, unified meaning. But we also see Miller locating the deconstructive operation of Mrs. Dalloway within the figure of trees and their swaying branches, a figure that does repeat throughout the novel. So if you turn to 181, we see Miller doing this pretty much right away. Okay, so on 181, so the second paragraph on the page, if it is true for all individual minds in relation to the universal mind, if this is true, so what he was talking about before, that's not important. Well, it is important, but not at the moment. Then all individual minds are joined to one another far below the surface of separateness, as in Matthew Arnold's image of coral islands which seem divided but are unified in the depths. The most important evidence for this in Mrs. Dalloway is the fact that the same images of unity, of reconciliation, of communion, well up spontaneously from the deep levels of the minds of all the major characters. One of the most pervasive of these images is that of a great enshadowing tree, which is personified, a great mother who binds all living things together in the manifold embrace of her leaves and branches. The image would justify the use of the feminine pronoun for the narrator, who is the spokeswoman for this mothering presence. No man or woman is limited to himself or herself, but each is joined to others by means of this tree, diffused like a mist among all the peoples and places he or she has encountered. So here Miller is sort of mimicking Clarissa's own reference to a mist, right? That she is laid out like a mist between people. I think that's on page 9 of the novel, right? But he sees the image of tree and actually tracks that through a series of passages on the next page, and that figure of a tree as that connective tissue is something that does unify all of those things together, even as it operates also as a figure of separation, of falling as well. Okay. So bottom of 182, deep below the surface, in some dark and remote cave of the spirit, each person's mind connects with all the other minds in the vast cavern where all the tunnels end. Peter Walsh's version of the image of the maternal tree ends, nevertheless, on an ominous note. So here we get that second. So Miller is showing how both the positive idea of connection, but also this more ominous idea, is all wrapped up in that one ambiguous figure of a tree. To reach the great figure is to be blown to nothingness with the rest. This happens because union with the general mind is incompatible with the distinctions, the limitations, the definite edges and outlines, one thing here, another thing there, of daylight consciousness. The realm of union is a region of dispersion, right? This, of course, is a useful passage to pair up with his quote the passage near the end of the book chapter, where he says, death is the realm of true communion. Like, these are the kinds of irreconcilable readings that Miller is holding in suspension, okay? And the image of a tree is one image with which he tries to capture both of those things, okay? So, first tendency, deconstruct binaries, show that the inferior term often infiltrates and upends the hierarchy of a binary opposition. Second thing, try to find a figure or image that, in its ambiguity, captures that whole deconstructive process. Okay, so those are two tendencies. What else do deconstructive critics attempt to do? To disclose the productive disunity at the center of a text. Well, they betray the codes of reading that we bring to bear on a text, or that a text seems to encourage us to bring to bear on it. So this is the fourth quote on the handout. The critic will be, this is Culler again, the critic will be alert to other forms of the text's difference from itself. At its simplest and least specifically deconstructive, this involves an interest in anything in the text that counters an authoritative interpretation, including interpretations that the work appears most emphatically to encourage. The closeness of deconstructive readings lies not in word-by-word or line-by-line commentary, but in attention to what resists other modes of understanding. We find, for example, an emphasis on the literal formulations employed at points in a text where unifying understanding encourages paraphrase or figurative interpretation. What the hell is Culler talking about? Right. Here he's discussing how deconstructivists mess around with how to read a text, or how one should be reading a particular text, purposefully making a conscious mistake of reading a metaphor literally, for instance, reading a literal statement figuratively, reading a work of literature as if it were a work of philosophy, and vice versa, a work of philosophy as if it were a stylized work of literature. And why do this? Because in doing so, one begins following other tracks and traces, leading toward potentially fruitful, productive, or, to put it simply, interesting readings of a text. Where do we see this in Miller? Return to page 181 again. I was just there and almost read the wrong passage. So top of 181. This is going to be somewhat taken out of context. One implication of this relation between the narrator's mind and the characters' minds is that, though for the most part the characters do not know it, the universal mind is part of their own minds, or rather their minds are part of it. Then turn to 186. I already read this paragraph too, I think. The temporal placement of Clarissa's experiences at Burton is equally ambiguous. The now of the sentence describing Clarissa's plunge is the narrator's memory of Clarissa's memory of her childhood home, brought back so vividly into Clarissa's mind that it becomes the present of her experience and of the reader's experience. Okay, so why am I reading these? Okay. Note Miller's phrases, which actually appear throughout this book chapter, the narrator's mind and the narrator's memory. Usually these sorts of phrases would only make sense if we had a first-person narrator, right? If the narrator was a character in the story, right? That's not the case in Mrs. Dalloway, right? So it's a bit weird then that Miller refers to the narrator as having a mind or having a memory, or of the narrator's way of arranging and presenting the plot as an act of remembering the story, right? What on earth does that mean? We see on these pages Miller's insistence on treating the narrator as a mind with its own memory. I just sort of said that. Here he takes a convention, a typical narrative convention, that a third-person narrator often speaks in the past tense. He takes it literally, pursuing the implications of this idea through an intensely close analysis of the tenses at work in the opening pages of the novel. He can only do this by turning this rather conventional technique of storytelling, which we don't even usually think about, into a deeply philosophical and theoretical feature of Woolf's novel. Whether or not Woolf would have recognized Miller's interpretation in these pages, and you should really read, in its entirety, 186 to 187 and on to 188 to get a full picture of what he does by taking the narrator's temporal position in relation to the story literally, as opposed to just conventionally. You should go read that. Whether or not Woolf would have recognized that interpretation is beside the point for a deconstructivist. Even if she did not intend for us to see these things at work in Mrs. Dalloway, the novel is nevertheless involved in Miller's thinking, at the root of his interpretive work. The usefulness of Miller's interpretation here is that it might actually make us wonder about the perspective of other novels, and to ask ourselves a question made famous somewhat by another French theorist named Roland Barthes, who, in a very famous essay called The Death of the Author, asks of a work of literature, he quotes, a narrator speaking about one of the characters. And again, it's a third-person narrator, and Barthes asks famously, "Who is it that is speaking thus?" So jarring us out of the convention of just assuming that this is just a narrative voice telling us a story, taking it literally as a voice telling us a story, and telling us a story in past tense, meaning that it is a story that is remembered, a story told by a mind, leads to a very fruitful, well, if you're sympathetic to Miller, a fruitful account of how time itself is working in Mrs. Dalloway. Okay. This way of reading, which betrays the codes and conventions we might typically bring to bear on a text, also anticipates a specific way in which deconstructivists focus on passages that are then treated as moments of self-referentiality in a work of literature, as moments in which a work of literature is reflecting on its own literariness. This would be the next quote on the handout, which I'm not going to read. You can look at it yourself. This is often called reading against the grain. Okay. Actually, in some sense, betraying codes and conventions in general is called reading against the grain. But treating specific sentences or phrases in a novel as somehow being self-referential to how the novel itself operates. This is a specific way in which to read against the grain. Where do we see moments like this in Miller? Well, in his very thesis, His argument is not that repetition simply is the resurrection of the dead in Mrs. Dalloway. That's not what he says. That thematically, repetition operates in the story as the resurrection of the dead. Rather, his argument is that the repetition of the past in narrative itself, operates as the resurrection of the dead. That narrative itself is remembrance. Narrative itself is the repetition of the past. Narrative is, in language, in this sort of dead realm, with no more flesh and blood, the only possible zone in which the resurrection of the dead is possible. Thus, the issue of narrative, of literary storytelling itself, is part of the thematic and conceptual operation of Mrs. Dalloway. In a way, it's not altogether clear how much this is a deconstructive tendency and how much it is a holdover from new criticism. After all, Cleanth Brooks often read poems as if they were ultimately about poems, and about how poems worked. But be that as it may, it might be useful to look at another example, because that might have been a bit too abstract, So look on 178, at the top of 178, We get a quote extracted from its context at the top of the paragraph. "Nothing exists outside us except a state of mind." Taken out of its context, that sounds like a theoretical or philosophical statement, that you could sort of think about and digest and chew on. Miller continues, "This seemingly casual and somewhat inscrutable statement is reported from the thoughts of the solitary traveler in Peter Walsh's dream, as Peter sits snoring on a bench in Regent's Park." This is after his first meeting with Clarissa. The sentence provides an initial clue to the mode of existence of the narrator of Mrs. Dalloway. The narrator is that state of mind which exists outside the characters, and of which they can never be directly aware. This is a simple example, but I hope you can see what I'm trying to say here. That what Miller does with this passage is extract it from its context. He admits that it comes from a passage in which Peter Walsh is just sort of dreaming and thinking about really nothing, maybe. But in extracting it from that context, Miller turns it into a moment in which the novel is telling us something about how its narrative perspective is operating. Okay, it's not just about Peter. It's not just about what Peter is thinking. It's about how the novel is working, right? And so there's this moment of self-reflection where the novel sort of looks at us through the fourth wall and is saying, like, look at this, right? Isn't this a perfect description of how I'm working? Right, so that's often what a deconstructivist is on the lookout for, like phrases or passages in the novel which can be extracted and framed as if they were the novel's commentary on itself. Okay. All right, so the last two passages in Culler's handout can be a bit difficult to well, the last one's sort of straightforward, but the penultimate one is a bit difficult, so I'll talk about that one last. I don't know why I ordered it that way, but anyway. The last two passages on Culler's sheet deal with reading the binary oppositions that I talked about in the first tendency as oppositions of various readings or interpretations, right? In other words, the novel's drama is treated as if it were an interaction or competition between different modes of reading. The last, I'll explain that in a second, but the last passage on the handout, Culler shows rather that deconstructive critics also tend to want to focus on marginal moments in a text, moments that don't get a lot of play in other works of literary criticism, or that may have gone unnoticed on a first reading, right? In Miller's book chapter, we see an example of the latter in his lengthy reading of that odd moment where an ancient, ragged woman seems to be spouting nonsense or singing a song. It's a very odd moment in Mrs. Dalloway that most critics don't really know what to do with, right? They don't know what to do with it, right? But anyway, what Miller does is by focusing on it, he develops a reading of this moment as a literary allusion to a song by Richard Strauss, comparing his translation, Miller's translation of Allerseline, with phrases in the rather mystical paragraph that follows the incomprehensible sounds that are recorded, right? So from page 190 of Miller's article, the parts of the song not directly echoed in Mrs. Dalloway identify it as a key to the structure of the novel. In this way, Miller shows that it is often fruitful to look where we might not initially desire to look, where no one else seems to look, at the shadowy parts of a text where obscurities might actually end up being illuminating, enlightening, and even transformative in our understanding of how a text operates. Okay, so that's the last quote on the Culler handout. But what of that penultimate passage? If you read it on your own, it may be somewhat confusing, right? And really, in a way, this one might not figure too well in Miller's work. But it is pretty usual. It does tend to be something that deconstructivists like to do, reading the drama of a novel as the drama of binary oppositions and as a drama of competing modes of interpreting the book itself, right? And in this way, the novel's drama actually anticipates, right, any attempt to interpret it by dramatizing in this self-reflexive way how we might read it. Just as Derrida tends to look at things that are not literature as texts, right, whether they be cultures or films or works of philosophy, gestures, etc., so deconstructivists tend to look at a lot of perceptual operations, looking, seeing, thinking, as modes of reading. Okay. This will anticipate our unit in a few weeks on psychoanalysis. Septimus Smith, after all, is the center of a variety of reading projects of interpretation, that is, projects of extracting meaning from otherwise meaningless behavior. Whether we consider Peter Walsh's evaluation of the couple, right, which I talk about in the first video on your paper, or Dr. Holmes's insistence that his behavior does not mean anything pathological, or Dr. Bradshaw's diagnosis of rest, or Clarissa Dalloway's lengthy reading of Septimus' suicide, it is clear that reading or interpretation is dramatized in Mrs. Dalloway. It's part of what is actually happening among the characters. It's not just something I do to the novel, it's immanent to the novel itself, right? Inherent and intrinsic to the novel itself, to the text, to how the text is operating. A deconstructivist might try to show how earlier readings of the novel by other literary critics actually correspond to these modes of reading and interpreting Septimus, showing how Woolf, or at least Mrs. Dalloway, actually anticipates every effort to make some sense of it, holding all of these competing readings in suspension, one distinct from, in opposition to, but also in a kind of blurred equation with, or adequation with, each other, okay? Where it is completely undecidable how we should read Septimus. Okay. That's what a deconstructivist would say. It's not necessarily what I'm saying, or how I read the novel, but that's what a deconstructivist might argue. Okay. All right, so quickly to summarize, these 6 tendencies. Tendency number 1, identifying, locating, and tracking binary oppositions, finding moments in a text where the deprivileged term or the inferior term actually announces itself as the superior term, or as the condition under which the term that we usually think of as superior, life over death, where death becomes the condition, right, of the repetition of life. Okay. So that, in that sense, deconstruction attempts to destabilize or show how binary oppositions are already destabilized in works of literature or any text. The second thing, deconstructivists also tend to focus on and analyze singular images that encapsulate, in a sense, in their very ambiguity, this whole process of the deconstruction of binaries or of oppositions. The third thing, what was the third thing? Oh yeah, the betrayal of codes and conventions that we are either taught we should bring to bear on a text, or that the text itself seems to want us to bring to bear on it, right? Charles Dickens certainly would not have wanted us to read Hard Times as a philosophical text, or maybe he would have, but maybe not. He would have wanted us to read it as a novel. But why do we have to do that? Right? A deconstructivist might say, what if we heuristically and provisionally experiment with treating it as something other than a novel? Right? And so to read metaphors literally, to read literal passages metaphorically, to read literature as philosophy, to read philosophy as literature, to read direct statements as theoretical statements, all those ways of reading against the grain. That's the third tendency of deconstructive criticism. The fourth is to locate passages, remove them from their context, honor their context, acknowledge their context, but remove them from their context and treat them as if they were moments where the novel is self-referentially drawing attention to how it works, right? Where the novel is poking its head through the fourth wall and saying, this is how I work, this is how I work. A lot of postmodern novels do this explicitly, but a deconstructivist would say that, even a realist novel, one can find moments in which this happens. The fifth one is the fifth tendency is that deconstructivists often look at the drama between characters or the opposition between binary terms as oppositions or competitions between various modes of reading and interpretation. And so they argue that in this sense, the work of literature actually anticipates our attempts to make meaning of it, right? And not only that, but in dramatizing those attempts at reading it, holds all those efforts to stabilize its meaning in suspension. Okay, we see this in the example of Septimus. He is a kind of node of various reading projects, none of which, maybe Clarissa's, none of which really get at the heart of the matter. Okay, because there is no heart of the matter. The last one, deconstructivists like to spend time lingering with marginal passages from novels and arguing that those obscure or shadowy passages are actually key to understanding how we can open up, break open, and disclose the undecidability that's at work in the work of literature itself. Okay, so binary oppositions, single ambiguous terms, reading against the grain, moments of self-referentiality, which might not be intended moments of self-referentiality, reading into the novel, dramas of competing interpretations, right? Actually that are intrinsic to the novel, and lastly, attention to marginal features or shadowy moments in the text. Okay, these are all strategies or tendencies of deconstructive literary criticism, at least 5 of which are at work in Miller's book chapter. Okay. All right, well, I hope that helped. I'll get the Culler document uploaded, and I look forward to reading your papers next week and over spring break. After spring break, in 2 weeks' time, we'll be coming around to our unit on psychoanalysis, which should be fun, and I'll get some articles posted for that next week as well. Okay? All right, well, have a great week, and I'll see you in 6 days. All right, bye.